What's good, people? We got to talk about how United the Seven Kingdoms saved Game of Thrones. Man, we have to really talk about how this season of United the Seven Kingdoms has been. And we have to say it really saved Game of Thrones. When we look at when Game of Thrones came out, the show in general was spontaneous, it was unique, it was cultural in terms of the cultural impact it had because everybody was watching it. That was the main thing. When Game of Thrones came out, if you're watching Game of Thrones, you were missing out. It was Breaking Bad, the Game of Thrones. I don't think we've ever had a peak TV season such just like Game of Thrones. Like season for season for season, like it was just epic. And I feel as though it already had a fan base of people who had read the books and they had waited and anticipated for this. And I just felt as though the way it ended just unfortunately just kind of spoiled everything. Because when you look at Game of Thrones as a whole, there's a reason why people call it one of the best shows ever. There's a reason why it's got a huge fan base. It's because of, the content, the the storytelling. All of that was amazing. I mean, you have to give the applause to George R. R. Martin, even though we haven't got the last book. But it's really based on all his work. So looking at season 1, 2, 3, 4, especially those particular seasons where we start off at first with Ned Stark, Hand of the King. We lose Ned Stark. Everyone's fighting for the throne. We have Cersei fighting after Robert Baratheon's death. We have everyone doing what they're doing. We have the North fighting the Lannisters, Stark's Lannisters. We're having Daenerys trying to claim the Targaryen throne. We're having Jon Snow, watching for the what's behind the wall. We're hearing about the White Walkers. We're having all these different elements. It really gave a good formula because we're having dragons, we're having White Walkers, we're having, call them zombies if you want, but we're having all these different elements, and it really, it brings in a lot, you know. Like you have Walking Dead that would normally just have zombies, but in Game of Thrones you'd have your White Walkers, so it would bring an element of Walking Dead. Then you have your element of Lord of the Rings, with the whole mystic stuff, the wolves, dragons, witches. So it really was a show that brought the best of a lot of both worlds, a lot of worlds, best of both worlds, particular kind of show. So at a particular time, Game of Thrones was amazing. But then somehow, it got to a point where it deviated a lot away from the books, which was exciting for a lot of fans, because it made them feel as though even though I've read these books, anything can happen. You don't, at a particular time, an episode will come out, you'd be waiting for it, and you would not know what would happen. And I think that was amazing. That was a big thing. But at the same time, this is where the downfall came. It was left to the directors. And as we got to 5 and 6, we start seeing things shape a bit differently. But there was no complaints. I felt as though people weren't really complaining as much until Daenerys went and burned King's Landing. I think that's when people just lost the plot. There was already whispers already like they've ruined the show. A lot of people weren't too happy. Like, how quick did she turn into the princess or prince that was promised into somebody that just destroys women, children, kids? Where all that happened so quick. So you can see that a lot of people were really ticked off. And then it just got worse. It left us with, a finale. And I think what was unfortunately the wrong formula for this was the fact that they gave us 10 episodes for a lot of these seasons. And for the final few seasons, like season 5 and 6, we got probably a good 6 episodes. It felt rushed. It felt like they had 6 episodes to wrap this thing up, and there was a lot that they had to do with the characters that they couldn't do. 4 particular reasons why they had 6 episodes. I'm sure they had their reasons. Maybe because of the budget. Who knows? But it felt as though it was rushed. We get to the last episode, and we see Jon Snow ends up just, murdering the love of his life, Daenerys Targaryen. And that really, the way his own ending, like, I remember when watching that, and we had the adverts, and it went off, and then everyone's thinking to themselves, like, what's just happened? Like, a lot of people were shocked, but, like, what's just happened? As soon as they tuned back, after the adverts, it just went downhill. They're trying to find out who should be king now. Jon Snow's taking the block again, and that was it. So yeah, there was a lot of people that weren't really too pleased about how the show ended, and it went pretty fast. After all of that, it kind of gave a bit of a stain to the show. And many people thought, okay, yeah, this show, nice done. A lot of people really left with a bit of a bad taste in their mouth about Game of Thrones in general, and they didn't really follow through. So I think that was really the big criticism. A lot of people didn't like the show. A lot of people felt as though they just did too much at a particular time. And it left a pause, It became the flop. The show was a flop. Not many people watching it no more. Everyone sort of left off. That's when, of course, they came in with, I'd say it was 4 or 5 years. They came in with House of Dragons and everything's slightly changed a bit. People are a bit more optimistic to see, okay, how's this going to be? And how much are they going to stick to the books? And I think the good thing about it was the story writing. I felt as though they were able to lean in towards the whole image with the Targaryens in general. And a lot of people really fancied something fresh, something new, something that doesn't kind of taint what's already been watched already. Nobody at that particular time was ready to see those sequels. Sequels was just not the thing. So I think going to the prequels was the best decision. But still, there was still a bit of a taint that we could probably fully say wasn't washed at all. Then it came with A Night of Seven Kingdoms. And I think that's when a lot of people literally just fell in love again with the show. They fell in love again with, George R. R. Martin's vision, and especially Duncan Egg. Looking back at that show, one of the biggest reasons why it did as good as it did was it just matched the books. Didn't deviate, didn't do something completely different. It stuck to the books. Now, a lot of people that were fans that were just good readers, they watched the books and they said, oh, yeah, this is it. This is literally what we're here to see. You're just depicting exactly what we're waiting for. And I think the fact that they did it in such a concise way was everything that was needed. They stuck to the books, they did what they needed to do, and they just showed the visuals of what people have already read already. And I think you just could not go wrong with that. It was fresh, it was new, it was completely away from some of these action story plots, deviating really away from the actual characters and the developments of them. And I think that's what changed the whole dynamic in general. And I think that's why A Night of Seven Kingdoms did very, very, very well. One advantage that it had as well was the 6 episodes. I felt as though if they probably had 10 to 15, that would have been a bit of a drag. A lot of people would have been like, man, this might be a bit too much, a bit boring. But the 6 concise episodes it was everything that we needed, where no fillers, no wasted scenes, everything was just efficient. And it really gave a good plot to the story. So definitely, I feel that's why the A Night of Seven Kingdoms did very, very well. And then we go to just how short those actual scenes were. I feel as though when you have a show that just focuses on the characters, you can't go wrong. Doesn't matter how low the budget. And I think that gave an example that you can have TV shows with low budgets. Don't ever hear that all these big budgets has got to gross this amount. You saw the views it did. You saw the reviews it did. Just based off character development. And I think that's what that show showed, which I felt with Game of Thrones, it kind of drifted away from, with too much of the action, too much of trying to get more theatrics out of it. You imagine all that CGI, all of that just to get poor reviews. It really showed the difference. And I think that is something that a lot of shows will learn, that you don't need 10 episodes. You don't need CGI. You don't need every single episode you could just have good storylines, especially if you've got people and fans that are already engaged anyway. People are going to like it anyway. And I think that's why it did so well. It really revived a lot. And I think it had a bit of a similarity to what a lot of fans loved with Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings was more of a humble beginning show which had a development. It gave you a journey. You felt like you were in that actual journey. You felt like you were Frodo. You're going all the way to. It felt like you're going all the way to Mordor. There wasn't too much of action. Well, it was more based on the actual storyline. And I think with A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, we're getting that from that as well. So definitely, I feel as though it really made a difference. And now a lot of people are back on the shows. People are now watching the Game of Thrones. People are now getting back on the House of Dragons. They know that's coming out in summer. So it gave a big boost to all of these shows. And that's just one season. That's one season. You can imagine season twos. You know, I felt before they were probably speaking about HBO talking about probably only 2 seasons. Now we hear George R. R. Martin. All of a sudden he's got other books. Now we're talking about more seasons. People want to see more. So it really shows that storylines are the best way to get the best out of a show. The storylines. This will be an example going forward. Maybe for the sequels now. I don't talking about Game of Thrones sequels before. People talking about sequels, so it really shows that sticking to good storylines is the way forward. And I think that's what A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms did. And we can't wait. We can't wait to see much of that. We know 2027 we're going to get the new one. So definitely, guys, stay tuned for that. We've got more and more of those breakdowns. We really need to go into a lot of these characters, what's going to happen, particularly in season 2. We'll definitely have a breakdown for that. So make sure you like, comment, share, subscribe, especially